we are very happy to welcome you to the Architecture, Urban Space and Politics online book launch. Today is day 3. We've already done 2 days. So the first day was addressing questions around violence and media and the way in which they are, both of these elements are interconnected, and the way that they are perpetuated either symbolically or a little bit more kind of literally. So both through visible and invisible, through means of kind of visible and invisible means. The second day, which was yesterday, we addressed questions around dissidence and urban commons, and Dagmar will give a kind of a deeper overview. But we also touched upon in terms of the way in which dissidence and kind of questions around politics, how that can be brought into the pedagogical system, and how can we basically support or guide more conscious and more politically aware students. Today is day 3, so it's Ecologies of Climate, Ethics and Postcolonialism, and tomorrow we've got our very last day. So this online launch is just a gift that keeps on giving. In terms of me, I always forget to introduce myself. My name's Nikolina Bobic. I'm a lecturer in architecture at the University of Plymouth in the UK.
My name is Farzaneh Haghighi. I'm a senior lecturer in architecture at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and one of the co-editors of this book. I want to first take a moment to thank Professor Stephen Walker and Associate Professor Dagmar Reinhardt for accepting to come on board for moderating and chairing the book launch sessions across 4 days. We appreciate your generous support to this project all through. Without further ado, I hand it over to Dagmar that she will be giving us kindly an overview of yesterday launch and moderating this session.
Okay, super. Thank you, Farzaneh, and thank you, Nikolina, for the possibility and also the big honor here to host the third day together with my dear colleague, Stephen. I'm going to lead the session here. And, it was a really interesting conversation yesterday to talk about dissidence and urban commons. We had a lot of people from all around the globe reporting back from their respective chapters, but particularly on these 2 questions: how can architects and spatial practitioners reclaim agency? And significantly also, as a second question, how can pedagogy or inclusive practices help engineer a more hopeful future? Those questions were answered in depth and in detail also from the area of practice, and some of the suggestions that came up were by making better futures, providing socioeconomic opportunities, by people who looked at self-organized spaces, architects supporting their communities, people plans, informal settlements, and commons, making things work with little that is at hand. The larger part of the conversation then turned to how we actually use that in pedagogy. Whereas actually I would like to suggest is between practice and pedagogy, there's not so much a distinction because we keep learning as architects, but some of the golden nuggets and the stones of provocation that came out of that, which I found actually really refreshing, were a number of 5 comments. So students need to understand that they are becoming political animals because we're all political beings, and it is our way to guide them and impart agency in ways that are sustainable and ethical. We as architects, as much as researchers and academics, are also informing our clients and informing the councils that we work with these big ideas. So a part of the pedagogy is also, of course, directed towards those stakeholders and user groups. So we've been talking about pedagogical approaches that ensure that students become comfortable with uncertainties, which I think in this particular climate we tend to really work with. A guided curricula is also something that is very provocative and a new way to drive, to reflect on positions in the world and in an open-minded way, to enable studios that go against abstractions and beyond the framing of the picture. There was some disagreement if politics or spatial politics actually should be taught, or if we should allow students to develop that for themselves. So enable students to find that through hints and suggestions. So there was a bit of conversation around the panelists with that. But I think one of the bigger pieces is also to guide students to understand the relationships, how certain relationships change from others, and what their stake is in participation in these sets of relationships. In summary, teaching the ethics of the profession. More of those conversations can actually be found through each of those chapters. That are and also in the overall discussion, which I think at some moment we will, or Nikolina and Farzaneh will position as either full length or edited video. So there's ample opportunity also to go back to that. Now for today, yeah, I do have the big pleasure to lead this webinar on ecologies of climate ethics and post-colonialism. And I'm very happy to have such a large amount of panelists here today, again, from across all over the globe. So I'm now throwing the ball to Daniel. Please take it away.
Hi, I'm Daniel Ryan. I'm senior lecturer in architecture at the University of Sydney. I've background I guess, in architecture and environmental design, but probably for the last 10, 15 years have focused really on architectural history, particularly unpacking, let's call it the thermopolitics of tropical housing, particularly. And so obviously have a strong interest in histories of climate and what people say it can make them do and will do to them. I'll throw it across to Kavita.
So my name is Kavita Gonsalves, and I currently lead sustainability within Populous, which is an experience and architecture firm that currently looks at looks at stadium and entertainment design. Yes, so I'm particularly interested in a holistic view of sustainability and what that means within community resilience and building up our communities for an ongoing crisis.
Thanks, Kavita. So I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Newcastle. My background's in architecture, contemporary art practices, industrialized construction, and earth building. So a bit of a mixed bag across all of those. Delighted to be here, and I'm going to throw it across to Lucy.
Hello all, and hello from Ireland. I'm in Ireland, but I'm actually from Scotland, and I'm an independent researcher. I write about philosophy because I'm a philosopher. So I wrote this book, Philosophy. Oh, you probably can't see it. Let's see. Oh, I don't know if you can see it. I don't know where my camera is. Anyway, philosophy as practice. Oh, there we go. Philosophy as practice in the ecological emergency. And I also write about compassion as agency. So I'm particularly interested in the practice of what we do in the ecological emergency, which isn't just climate change and biodiversity loss and pollution and the external or externalities that we see, but also involves political and social polarization and fragmentation, and also personal fragmentation. I'm also a yoga and meditation teacher, so I work a lot on what we can do individually and how we can organize ourselves individually to look after our own obstacles to practice, and then how that allows us to become more effective in connecting with others and creating organization within communities and then hopefully within society.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I too am living in Ireland these last 30 years, but I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And very like Lucy, I'm and Sarah, I've got a background in contemporary art, previous to that, research science, but also have worked with a lot of forestry NGOs. I have set up, post my PhD, an unusual online educational platform, bringing what I sort of addressing the crucial gap I see in higher creative education about eco-literacy and values-based learning. I'm an accredited Earth Charter educator. This is under the banner of Education for Sustainable Development. And this is also, I have increasing numbers of architects reaching out to me because they need a simple means to think about integrated environmental, social, peace, political, social justice, gender justice values. And the Earth Charter has been around. It's celebrating its 25th anniversary in The Hague and the Peace Palace this year. And it's arisen as a need, I suppose, to incorporate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but have an accessible form. And it's available in 66 languages, including Irish, just recently. So I'm very delighted to be here. Thank you.
I'm Stephen Walker from the University of Manchester, and I've been peripherally involved. I wrote the intermission for the first volume of the handbook and have been involved in the last few episodes or last few days of this mega book launch. So back to Dagmar.
Yeah,
Who's going to
thanks.
drive us on this morning.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And I just realized this happens if you're spending a long time at the party. My name is Dagmar Reinhardt. I'm an associate professor at the University of Sydney. And so parts of my passion have always been digitization of architecture, but also digital literacy, which has taken me through grasshopping and coding towards acoustic simulations, but also robotic fabrication. We are way beyond, I think, technologies being the answer to everything. We thought that for roughly 15 years, and now we know it's not going to happen and we can't work with that, which is why I think particularly this panel is so interesting, because the idea or the combination of ecologies of climate ethics and post-colonialism is something that is a political practice. Through the mechanisms of architecture and urban design is something that is wildly interesting, because we suddenly have a much bigger problem and a very different scope and different lens. So we have two questions which we have set to the panelists. I'm just going to read them out so that we remember them. What alternative projects can we speculate on for a more inclusive and thriving future? And the second question is, how can these inclusive projects be actualized rather than left within theory? So how can we move that to practice? So what's the wild idea and how can we move that to practice? I do have 2 or 3 other lenses that I wanted to bring in. So how do we do that through digital technologies? Because this is the language through which we're all speaking. And it cannot be something that has primacy, but it can be something that that actually informs these spatial politics. What are the tools for resilient spatial societal material? And what methods are at our disposal? I
suppose I'm not someone who speculates much on the future. I mostly unearth the past. And so sometimes it's more like at times a history of the future, if anything. One thing I am starting and interested in at the moment is actually the eco-city of Curitiba. And I suppose that it kind of emerged in the 90s as a case, a kind of critical case of almost a potential global solution to how to live together in cities and that. But it's interesting when you start looking at it, because on paper and in some ways it was the key case study going through college in the late 90s and early 2000s, is actually just how at different moments we draw a boundary around issues to do with climate and ecology. So the thing that nobody was talking about in architecture of Curitiba as a model eco-city was that it had actually emerged. It was starting to also become a rival city to Sao Paulo for oil refining and for car manufacturing, but this doesn't get into the discourse. The other one is about pulling out between climate and ecology. A place like Curitiba is fascinating because if you know it or think about the discourse around it, there's no discussion of climate there. It's all ecology and poverty and commons and transport. So it's a fascinating one because it's in the subtropics in Brazil, and yet the discourse of climate doesn't get applied to it. So I think that's interesting because it also opens up about how we climatize certain places and then don't talk about climate in other places, and how we ecologize certain places and then don't talk about it in other places too. So that in that sense, I think there's a kind of a history and a sort of a moment that we need to pull apart, that often discourses on climate in North America and Europe are really discourses on energy largely, and then discourses on climate within the tropics are often essentially histories of environmental determinism, a lot about what civilization and climate sort of discussions come out there. And the ecological part then I think is one a bit to do with ideas about order as well. And so the part is sometimes about pollution, but also about at times about maybe nature in its place and actually living better with nature, but it's still a kind of a controlled nature in other ways. It's just different types of relationships. Ecology, though, is interesting too, because I think it also starts getting people to think more about relationality and how sort of the metaphor of ecology can also be applied to social relations, and then also to I guess between people and nature, and with that then a sense too about the problems of professional boundaries that also emerge. So I think I'll leave it at that. Maybe it's just sort of taking one historical case, because I think some of those things get mashed in together, and it's useful to pull them apart because they kind of have slightly different trajectories. And I guess in the future, the part two, the interesting is how it gets actually repackaged as well.
But this is what you're saying is, I mean, particularly the point about the history of the future. I think that's really interesting, because if you're taking climate from a historical perspective and how we have dealt with that, and then the climate moves and it changes, and we can see it geographically that climate zones move over into other zones, so that there's a history that would already be familiar to us, which is the future, or is a future that's just initiated, but it's the past for a different climate zone. There's actually a lot that we could learn from that. I would like to now call Kathy, sorry, just to pick it up from maybe like an earth moment before we move it to Sarah, for what you can do with that earth moment.
Well, I'm coming not from a background in architecture, but my own ongoing ecological art practice has been about transforming a monoculture plantation, a spruce plantation, common to many parts of the world, into a permanent biodiverse forest. That became the basis for my creative practice PhD and reviewing ecological art practices. And I was struck with how to talk about my work as caring not for just my own personal well-being, not for my social neighborhood, but also for planetary and intergenerational well-being. I was immediately struck, I don't have any children. How do I care for this going forward? So that led me down to looking at developing laws of ecocide. But then coming out of my university experience, it was very difficult to have a holistic practice in a very, I was in the humanities. So I had a background in science. So I was constantly finding I was troubling others. And I was told to get back into my discipline. Either, Kathy, you're in the arts, sociology, or the environment. You can't be doing all three. And this is where I was at. So when I came out, I felt compelled to start helping other creatives and educators move into this more holistic way of being in the world. It was more or less by looking at leading ecological thinkers that I came across the Earth Charter. It's been inspired by the great ecological thinker Thomas Berry, many others, Stephen Rockefeller, theologians, spiritual people from climate science. And I know in Australia, Professor Brendan Mackey of the IPCC's contributed lawyers, all sorts of things. And that gave me the language to talk about personal, collective, intergenerational and planetary well-being and all these different topics. And I think, I suppose I stress the Earth Charter is that we're all at the beginning of our eco-literacy journey, and particularly in higher education. And here I reference Professor Emeritus Stephen Sterling, who would be, I suppose, championing that we need to get this holistic way of thinking about the world into higher education.
Thank you, Kathy. So it's interesting because we started to talk about boundaries and these shifting boundaries, and we're sort of moving back from the idea that it's not really about architecture. It's not really even about urbanism. It's about understanding, and you say holistically a number of times, it's understanding the complexities in that system, acknowledging the complexities first, and then understanding that there's so many more parameter, criteria, aspects, however we want to call it, that come into the equation that we really need to collaborate together with other areas, domains, specifications in order to be able to just start to approach it in a way that we can work with and inhabit that system without leaving damage. How you can inhabit that system and give back from the system into the system is something that you, Sarah, you and the team have been developing further. So I would like to invite you now to really talk a bit about your approach to ecologies of construction and fabrication that comes from a very different perspective than what architecture practice is normally dealing with.
I mean, I think firstly, as an overview of where we're at in architectural education now, I think it's important to acknowledge the foregrounding of the Connecting to Country framework in all of the education that we're hopefully all doing. Here on Warramah country and Wabba country in Newcastle, that's very much heavily involved in everything that we do with the students, and it foregrounds everything. So that's actually become, I think, almost in there's not an ism, but it's definitely the strong style and approach and philosophical and theoretical grounding to everything we do. And I think that the whole concept, I went to a great talk by Glenn Albrecht, the philosopher, the other night, who actually referenced Kathy on the other side of the world for being a forerunner in this area in the arts, contemporary arts, and thinking about the symbiocene and the connections between things. And after doing her eco-literacy course while I was in Ireland, that's why I reached out to her about this project, and also Lucy as well, and others that were co-authors, because it really is that holistic view to things to projects that you need to take from every stage. I think from the conceptualization stage to the realization stage. And luckily, we wrote this chapter quite a few years ago when I was living in Ireland as well, and it was in the theoretical conceptual stage, and now we're moving into the built stage, a different phase of it. And I'm just seeing how important it is collaborating with different thinkers on this topic to make sure that you're really broadly thinking of all parts of this, the symbiocene, and us as part of that during the design process and the occupation process. So, and that, goes from the whole, the global scale to, in terms of construction, the supply chains and thinking about things like that, right down to the material, the relationships between the materials and the ecosystems that those materials are grown and harvested from, and what it does to those, from an environmental point of view, obviously from a well-being point of view, in terms of the process of working with these kinds of bio-based materials is something that I'm very interested in, and that's where Lucy can come in as well, in terms of how that contributes to the sense of well-being. But actually the process of being aware of oneself during the process of designing and making, and part of that system, hopefully it makes your ambitions for things a bit smaller and more grounded and contained, from an environmental footprint, social footprint point of view.
People are experiencing what's happening at the moment in society, particularly obviously American society, as increasingly chaotic, and to contrast chaos with order, I think, is a mistake. Instead, we can contrast chaos with organization, and we can go right down to the fact that we are organisms and that we have organs within us. So that was the focus of my meditation. I think, again, I work from a non-dualist perspective, a Zen perspective. So thinking about our own internal organization, how that works as a cooperation between systems, that we can then extend that to the hearth, the home, the architecture of where we live, which is where Sarah's work is incredibly important. And I was very struck by her attempts to work here in Ireland to actually construct in a local forest. These attempts were not successful. There's a huge amount of resistance to this kind of approach, and in that sense, I'm with Dewey in the sense that we need to be entirely pragmatic about what it is we can do, and that means reaching out to those in, for instance, here in Ireland, in Quilcher, which is the forestry body here, and instead of presenting ourselves as being in contrast, we somehow need to find ways to get to make connections with people who are interested in the kind of work that we're offering, in the kind of approaches that we're offering. So it's not just that there's an end in mind. I think that this has been a huge mistake with Western society in general, that we focus on what's happening then over there at that point in history, but we come back always to how we are acting in each moment, how we're speaking, how we are engaging. And this comes back to my practice as a social care worker, where we use a technique called TCI, Therapeutic Crisis Intervention, in which if there is tension or conflict, then we come back to what's my part in this? How can I change my actions and my language so that I become someone who is more able to continue to engage, even though, and I mean, Zelensky is a prime example of this. He managed to come back from what for most of us would have been a terminal conversation and continue the conversation. I think we need to be able to do that in the context of the ecological emergency. I'm afraid the only other thing I'd say is that I've moved my own stance from thinking that, you know, humans can be can keep wild nature, can do rewilding projects, to what Kathy's doing essentially, which is stewardship. And I think stewardship is a really important concept, and we can think of housing in terms of how we're stewarding the land.
That's wonderful. So can I move that and these keywords, including chaos and maybe stewardship, over to Nikolina knows what's coming. Nikolina, and then maybe also Farzaneh, because I had you on here as my Human Ecologies Agency and Violence spectrum. So over to you.
Thank you, Dagmar. Obviously, I like to be clear cut in terms of, you know, how I address all of these issues. And thank you. It's been wonderful to hear all of the different perspectives, which I think on one hand also talk about this idea that when we think about the different disciplines, and we've been talking about this idea of the interdisciplinarity, but it's also kind of thinking about that in terms of interconnectivity and how we examine these issues side by side. So everything that we do needs to be kind of addressed from these interconnected fields and the impact, both not just social impact in terms of questions around class, which is quite big in the UK whatever we examine here, but also questions around kind of gender politics, eco-politics, and so on. And I think there's something about kind of being aware of every action that we do here, and we all kind of in different parts of the, let's say, Western world, the impact that it might have, and the disproportionate burden that it might have on poorer countries and individuals who tend to be kind of victims of whatever that we kind of propose here as the answer to address various questions around sustainability. There are probably a few more things that I could add to this in terms of when I was saying and picking up on what Daniel was saying in terms of kind of history, and I'll kind of veer it off in a slightly different direction. I think when we are talking about questions around gender politics, we need to start to re-examine history and kind of give more, not just status, but also prominence and kind of the thinking to all of those, if we are talking about, let's say now in terms of women or female, and not just kind of females, but also more diverse role models, and those who have been excluded for history. So I think we need to dig a little bit deeper into the archives in order to open up this portfolio of voices and ideas that have been dismissed in a way or ignored. One part of my research that it addresses, it kind of deals with the questions of post-colonialism or semi-colonialism. We need to flip the rule book and look at the contexts that have been labeled in a particular way, whether it's peripheral or violent or chaotic. And I think that very kind of positioning and ordering how we think about peripheral or order a context as peripheral kind of starts to establish where the center is, which is a problematic problem in its own self, because it starts to kind of position a thinking that all of the answers need to come from the center or from a context that has been identified as one that kind of preaches reason and order and kind of freedom and so on. So often it is in these so-called peripheral contexts, or those that have been associated with disorder, that we can tend to find a decent toolbox in terms of how to address questions around social sustainability. How can we start to act both, not just from the head? We live in a context that starts to privilege a particular logical and structural optimization of everything, but how can we also act from the heart, and how can we imagine and act on an everyday basis a different future in a way that is a little bit less fear dependent, because there seems to be, especially in the climate and the world that we live in, that is kind of interwoven with one act of violence after another. There's kind of this element of fear that is kind of spread through media in everything that we do. So how can we kind of act from a place of fearlessness, and that will start to also expand how we think about citizenship. So it's not just something that we are attain at birth and the context in which we live in, or that we kind of attain a citizenship after a period of time after we live in the context, but how do we kind of approach that on a daily life through everyday actions. Probably have a lot more to say, but I will stop it and pass it on to Farzaneh.
Okay, I want to enter this conversation from a pedagogical point of view and something that I'm dealing with at the moment. So I'm based in academia, and as many of you, an important part of our job is teaching. And something that keep coming up in the conversation today, I think this idea of at the personal and collective. So the panelists are talking about the importance of the personal awareness, but also the collective endeavor. What I keep being encountered with is the pedagogical models that are highly individualistic, at least in the architecture setting that I teach with. But some of the problems and awareness that the students need to deal with can only be resolved at the collective level. And the question I'm kind of thinking about is whether we are teaching them to come together, think collectively, and encounter some of the ecology of bad ideas. So ecology is not necessarily always good. Bad ideas can have their own ecology as well. And one of them would be this individualistic personal gain, thinking about just getting a grade or a degree and graduating. So the shifting of this pedagogical model and bringing the importance of the collective learning, creating commons within the, at the moment I'm teaching a studio, so I'm just coming out of the studio teaching, so it's kind of fresh in my mind, is it needs a different kind of pedagogies. And are we, I think the question for me at the moment that I'm thinking, do we have the model to do that? And I think this goes back to the idea of agency. The agency at the moment perhaps is so much focused on the individual, and they want to be an architect, and an architect is we talked about it yesterday, would be a subject, it would be an individual, but how can we break this up to encompass the collective and the common as well, to face some of the ecological or climate issues that require the collective input.
So Farzaneh, when I was hearing I sense your struggle quite a bit as well, because I find that studio work, whenever I have thought as well, it comes down a lot to the individual, but it's really not reflective of how we're also working in practice. And one studio that did give me a lot of hope was a course that I did as part of the Creative Sustainability course in Aalto University, where they actually ran, I don't know if they still run it, but this is also from nearly 10 years ago. So they actually ran a studio, I don't remember the name of the studio, but what they did was at that time, they brought all the schools together, like the engineering school, the economy school students from these different schools, architecture, design, and they actually threw all of us into a project that we had to work together and design together. And there we were dealing with, I think at the end of the day, it really wasn't so much about the project as much it was about working with the dynamics, working with the collective, and how you bring a project to life. And how do you deal with, the worst group assignment behavior, and how do you cope with that, and how do you reach out to authority to manage those things and things like that. That's what really kind of came to mind with that. But going back to Dagmar's question, I think, or sort of, I think the point that I come from is sort of working in crisis, and how can community function in crisis? And that was kind of the basis of my PhD work, which sort of happened because it was running through COVID during the pandemic, and many PhD projects did not have much choice or had to really change the way they were working. But for whatever reason, the pandemic suited my project quite well, or it was made to suit it quite well, because we threw in digital technology and we actually worked with the marginal people who are actually within community who might not necessarily have access to resources. So we're talking about international students during that time who were actually, for example, asked to go back home during that time, but who decided to stay back and did not have any government support, did not have, a lot of them work in hospitality, so did not have access to that, any of that work. So we're really dependent on precarious work or handouts of some sort that were coming out. So this group of community actually worked within this project. And a big piece of the project was to actually deliver, it was a storytelling project that was actually tied to place, because they were international students. And just coming on the back end of what Nikolina was saying around citizenship and how we practice citizenship. How do we practice it when we've only been in a place for a year or even 6 months, and we're finding a place and we've ended in a pandemic where we have no access to community, no access to resources? So that was kind of the premise of the project. And even though the tool and the digital tool and the story that they had to craft was kind of the overlay, I would say, the underlay of the project was more that it gave people an opportunity to build relationships. So much so that the project ran for 10 weeks. So much so by week 6, they actually wanted to meet in person, but we couldn't because of restrictions. So we actually had a virtual meeting in Mozilla Hub, which is a virtual environment, which has now, I think, does not exist anymore or cannot be used anymore. We actually all met in that. And then 4 weeks later, when restrictions came down, we actually met in person, where people actually deployed their digital tools and were testing it out in the publics, because the tool was also around exercising ownership of place. And how do you do that with digital technology? And how do you use locative technology to actually place your story in place when you might not be there and nobody can remove it? Whereas, you can remove a stone, you can remove a statue, but locative technology, it's always there within the digital. So yeah, so the participants within this exercise agency in creating this story, they had to learn how to use the tool. But through that, they met people, they were exercising their agency in building this story. And also, the story was also experienced by many members of the community. So I think even though I was a researcher, it became more, after a while, it became more that I was just a facilitator and watching how these relationships were building and where they might go. And even though maybe many of them don't maintain that relationship, in that time, it was very important for them, very critical from mental health perspective, from a connection, intangible resource perspective.
That's also, it comes back to just a different layer of a tool or process that enables us to connect to space, to local context, to country, to climatic data, to geographical data, to boundaries that might be invisible to us, but which are nevertheless existing in there, and which need to sort of be, in some way or the other, need to be dealt with. I had a couple of other questions, and because we are here for the Handbook of Spatial Politics. And so one section is, how can we imagine this other future? And then how can we be very practical about that? Because in a way, we are forecasting from our experience and our, not only our knowledge, but also from the tools and methods that we have developed. So here comes the question. So for this better future, for making the world, in particularly within sort of the context of climate change, what's your favorite tool or method or process that you think can be adopted?
I think the thing that I'm learning through this project, trying to take the theory into reality, is that you have to be pushing from the ground up and the top down simultaneously. And that's the best way to get action and attention and support and people noticing, the urgency of situation, And I think just challenging that status quo and supporting from the grassroots level up, because, point that was made earlier about history and theory. I'm not going to go into that. That was my sentence.
Well, I want to echo something Sarah talked about, working with country in Australia and Indigenous wisdom. I think a big thing for me is to think about developing a narrative or a cosmology of place, wherever you are, re-indigenize yourself to place. Now, this is coming from Professor Jeanette Armstrong, an invitation that I'm here from New Zealand, living in Ireland, the home of my ancestors. For a long time, I felt uncomfortable talking, just referencing what Kavita said. How can we feel at home? How can we speak for the places that we're in? I'm also echoing again Thomas Berry, his work to think about eco-jurisprudence, eco-literacy, but his life's end work was about thinking about a new universe story. He worked with cosmologists, evolutionary, and so that's the direction I'm taking. But I also want to acknowledge what Lucy's been doing about compassion practice. That's a big part of our eco-literacy. And I also want to reference to my collaborator in my work, developing an eco-literacy pedagogy, is Dr. Nikos Papadakis. He too is a firm believer that we have to start with compassion practices, not just for our own well-being in this work, but to attune ourselves to the wider community of life and the cosmos.
I think Nico, who I haven't met, and I seem to have a lot in common. I've mentioned there in the chat Professor Nicholas Maxwell, who worked in the University of London and pushed hard to have the idea of what universities are for, and indeed what education is for, be moved from the acquisition of knowledge, which is effectively morally neutral, to a question of what would it look like if universities were there to help us to develop wisdom. And I think that so moving from knowledge to wisdom, how you do that in practical terms, I suppose, requires that you have the conversation. I'm very keen to emphasize that John Dewey's approach, which was developed really during the 1930s in America, of a pragmatic and as others have said, and particularly Nikolina, an inclusive and a collective approach can often be much more beneficial and then a systems-based approach.
I think the kind of one issue, and this is often a teaching side, is moving away from a sort of eco-perfectionism and assume you'll screw up actually and have a process for it. Like a lot of the thing, and it's tricky because almost the side is that every generation is like adding additional issues to deal with, and it's really hard to teach that as well, because you're often trying to cut through kind of a thread within that, while all of these problems seem to just constantly accumulate. So I think the other side to it is actually allowing students to do something and to assume it will work up to a point, but have a kind of, the forgiving detail is sort of, you go back to that type of thing if you're teaching going through construction or in terms of planning, and that therefore it's always the kind of adaptable system, I think is sort of comes from there. But at the practical level is often you just need the example to say, hey, this works, this doesn't quite work, and moving from that, as opposed to like, right, we're going to get it simulated 75 times. That one is obviously the right answer because we've gone to that point, and then the reality on the ground, that material or whatever can't be obtained in time.
For me, I think the tool is more, I think storytelling, particularly of crisis and of the apocalypse. And I think, and I put an additive tool, is that we backcast from that as versions of where we do not want to reach. So that's potentially, that's probably speaking to the next session, but yeah, I think we need to think of what those futures are, and we have plenty of that in science fiction and movies.
I mean, super stimulating conversation. And so my best, I'm supposed to do that as a moderator here, but so just listening to all of that, so walking in someone else's shoes, because I did the conclusion and I took these brilliant ideas from the handbook and ran with it through my robotic practice, which is my other leg. My other leg is actually also working with blind and partially sighted people, and so at the moment we do have a project with the ARC on accessible playgrounds, which is how playgrounds can become accessible to blind and partially sighted children and their carers. But of course, it's so much more than that, because the playground is the health compartment of the city. It's the green lung. It's the against the heat retention. It's for the water retention. It's the public space. So unfolding this through the lens of someone who uses it, but then everybody else, human and more than human, coming into that and really to looking at it as a reservoir of and as a point of what has been said here, stewardship for making these commons that are beneficial to everyone, and really moving through all these different layers. That's what I found superbly useful as a process, which has nothing to do with anything digital. That would have been my other practice here. So I think there's really something around being able to move and maybe also go much deeper into some of the aspects that have been thankfully brought up here. So the idea of eco-literacy, the idea, and I'm just dropping that in again here, the idea of SDGs that can really work as a very good angle for us to calculate how we can move through climate change and spatial politics. but also the idea of the symbiosine. Sarah, you mentioned that here. That's something I think that's still not a common ground for people to discuss. Are really very brilliant anchor points to go back into the handbook and to read up on those different chapters and to go deeper into that conversation that we just, sort of started to unravel here, the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to find in there. I would like to hand over to Nikolina and Farzaneh to conclude the session.
Thank you, Dagmar. I just wanted to say that thank you for wonderful insight, something that I think all of us can kind of take aboard and in one way or another appropriate in our kind of everyday practices or teaching practices. I think for all of us to be able to translate all of these thinking into something real and tangible, there is a part and a loop back that how we think what we do with ourselves individually. So picking up on Lucy's kind of practice of yoga or meditation, something that's quite close to my heart, even though I'm not a yoga teacher. There's something we need to think about our body. And when I say body, I mean kind of mind, body, and spirit in a kind of very integrated way. We need to kind of think about our body as a form of infrastructure and how we kind of open ourselves up. And that might kind of start to address some of these tribalism. At the end of the day, we can have all of these grand ideas and grand methods, but at a basic kind of human level, we also need to become more conscious of each other. Tomorrow is the very last day. All good things come to an end, but it'd be lovely to kind of continue with this conversation tomorrow. And we'll also have some panelists who came the previous 2 days, and we can bring all of these interesting ideas, I'll call them weird and wonderful ideas together and bring this discussion, not necessarily to an end, but hopefully to a different opening than how we entered this conversation a few days ago. Farzaneh?
Nothing to add. Just thank everybody for joining us today, the panelists, and also a thank to our audience who joined us today for the third episode. And we look forward to meet as many as you tomorrow for the last day. And hope you would. And thank you, Dagmar, for moderating this session so beautifully. Really appreciate it.
And thank you very much for the panelists for such open and conversation. Really like to have coffee.
Yeah, right. Okay, see you all tomorrow. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.